people are constantly writing and rewriting their own lives.
It's a privilege to be an artist, and it's also a responsibility.
I like art that makes you tremble, feel, cry.
There's a common thread that runs through my work, and I believe that's the human quality of frailty. I see in that frailty a beauty, and it's a response to that beauty that I think is manifest in my work, and it's the quality that links us together as people. I was born in 1937 in Glasgow, Nova Scotia. My dad was a fisherman and outside of the town. It was a poor existence, but a happy one. And my brother and I were the only two children in the family. Subsequently, my dad left, and we moved around a great deal, 17 times, in fact. But my brother and I were close. Early on, I recall the textural things and lighting. I recall lighting coming through stained glass, little stained glass window on the top of the stairs. And I remember thinking at the time, I think I see this in a different way than anybody else sees it. But then I had another thought, almost immediately, although I was very young. It was, I think everybody has that sense of seeing things differently. I still believe that I think of art as peculiar perception. I think the way we see the world and the way we see things is special to each of us. In schools in Glasgow, there wasn't any art instruction at all, really. Music was the thing, and rhythm band in grade 1, and from then on, it was singing and instruments. It wasn't my thing. I couldn't hold a tune, and I longed to draw and paint. So about 14 I was when I decided I would go out door to door and sell Christmas cards so I could get some money to buy art lessons. And two different teachers in Glasgow. One, I took charcoal and pastel, and the next year I took watercolor. I was encouraged by my mom. My dad had gone away when I was 9. I'd been encouraged to follow whatever dream I had in life, but I wasn't particularly steeped in any kind of art. When I went to Mount Allison, I took a minor in fine art. I thought you had to have some label across the top that said before you studied art formally, and I didn't. I was very young. I was just 17 when I started, and so I took a minor in fine art, and while there, it was a wonderful school. Alex Colville was the teacher, and Tom, Natalie Forrestal were students, as well as Chris and Mary Pratt. It was good encouragement. I remember being in the studio one day painting, and Mr. Colville and Ted Pulford came by, and I guess I was working late because I loved it, and I didn't keep track of the hours. And I remember them asking me why I wasn't in the fine arts program, and I was so young at the time, I should have questioned that more, perhaps. But it doesn't matter, because I did come back to it. And I realized the older I got that the more important thing is wanting to do it. That skill or following the rules wasn't nearly as important as the need or the desire to do it. When I first went to Mount A, I figured I would do social work. I was interested in people. I was torn between that and making art. Well, I wouldn't have even called it making art. I would have called it, I thought it would be painting. And as I say, I discovered that making sculpture, when I got to do that, there was never enough time in the day to do what I wanted to do, because at that point I was already doing social work. It was through social work that I met my husband Scott in 1961, and 3 weeks later we eloped, and subsequently had 3 wonderful children who were and continue to be an inspiration for my work. We were married for 22 years, and it was in the middle of this that I began to turn to weaving. The first piece that I did was Once Upon a Time, and it represents really just a vignette of my children. They'd grown pretty well then. They were about 10 years old, 9, 10, and 11. And I began with spinning. I had a spinning wheel and learned how to spin. And then this tapestry represents kind of a scene of the 3 children up in the backwoods, where now there are houses, but there used to be a wooded area behind a house on Creighton Avenue in Dartmouth. And the yarns are all dyed with natural dyes, plants and a little bit of indigo, coreopsis and rosehips, and 32 dye pots there were actually. And this particular piece, it took me 2 years to do it because I didn't know how to spin, and I was learning how to weave and exploring all this dyeing. So there was no particular hurry because I was doing it to give to the Dartmouth General Hospital, and it wasn't yet open. So it was an early work, and already I had in my head I'd like to frame it with sculptural trees. So I started, after this piece was finished, to weave sculptural trees. The first trees that I wove were not freestanding. They were actually hung from the ceiling. They were attached to irregular steel X's, which were wrapped, and they hung. They were made of hand-spun wool and draped roots on the floor, sometimes with nests, which were made of unspun flax, sewn and dyed silk cocoons. They're pretty representational versions of trees at this point. Around this time, I started weaving figures, this time using copper wire, woven. They were also pretty representational and life-size. They were made somewhat stiff by electroplating. And at this time, a man who was actually electroplating baby shoes was my resource. They were not sufficiently stiff to stand alone, so they required an infrastructure. Subsequently, I had electroplating done, which would allow the figure to be freestanding. My other figures during this early period, I would allow them to sit or slouch, as we often do, so the posture didn't have to be totally erect. They take on the flavor of the human posture. This is my loom, and on the loom right now I have probably the toughest material I've woven with, which is stainless steel, and it's for a 20-foot high tree. So while most times people would have yarn on their loom, I most often would have wire of some kind, copper or silver. But this time the stainless steel is about as tough as a material that I've woven with. And it wasn't the easiest thing to put on. But here we go, and it's going to be a 20-foot high tree, which is very simply woven, a layer on the top and again on the bottom, so that it appears like a flattened sock. It's about 14 inches across, which will mean about a 9-inch diameter tree. And that will be sculpted and formed once it comes off the loom. About halfway up, I will start branching out, literally, In other words, I'll weave a little tube over on one side and then over on the other, and then I'll wrap and wind the branches after it comes off the loom and attach it to the many leaves that will flutter from it. So it's very imperfect. There are little knobs that'll be on it just as there would on a tree, little knots and odd spaces. And I'll probably have to pull it apart to form it, so it won't be a perfect cylinder. It's a simple, straightforward weaving project, as odd as it looks, but there it is. The trees are woven, in this case, of stainless steel, and that's not easy. I can tell you, I've done it before, and I'm doing it again on a 20-foot scale, but steel wire is just about the hardest thing to weave on the loom. But that's these steel wires were woven on loom and then sculpted, and it didn't need any electroplating to keep it stiff because it was so stiff to begin with. The leaves are an interesting fabric. It's a tricot, a knit in Switzerland for Jacqueline Larson Fabrics in New York. And it doesn't fray around the edges, so one can cut the pieces of leaves. And it has a shimmering look, and it's nice with lots of light. These works range from the late 70s, actually, up until this year. The silver trees are my first work in silver. They're, I think, easy pieces for people to enjoy or appreciate, whereas some of the later figures might not be so easy. It's interesting to work with different kinds of wire. I love fine silver and gold. I have worked in gold, and they're very soft and malleable, very easy to work with. You don't have to use gloves to protect your hands. When I first started to work with fine silver, which is finer than sterling and quite delicate, the reflective surface interested me a lot. And it's just a beautiful material. There's something lovely about the material itself, its softness. Around the end of 1985, I was reflecting back on what had happened the previous year, and some of the experiences that had touched me most deeply in that year before were men I knew closely who had experienced various kinds of pain. And so the seminal piece for that series that I kind of called Man in Pain series was this one, which is Man in Black Coat. It might have been perhaps the simplest piece I did in the whole series, but it was the beginning, and for me it was a very personal observation of someone close to me who had worked through, with courage, a painful experience. This is called Anguish, and it doesn't really appear to be a man or a woman. It's a human being in anguish. And I'm surprised that people have responded to that piece, because it is dark and it does express what I observed in deep pain. To see a person in that kind of pain was a very overwhelming experience at the moment, and it kept coming back to me, that image of someone who was hurting beyond belief. Intuitively, I believe, perhaps always, that primitive forms such as these ancient Cycladic forms 2,000 and 3,000 BC have provided an inspiration for works such as Kindred Spirits. This is the last one of the original Kindred Spirit forms, which is still in this region. I made these in 1987 as part of an exhibition at Mount St. Vincent Gallery. And it was at this point, when I was weaving this piece on the loom with copper wire and seagrass weft, that the forms, I wanted them to be abstracted, but they were doing something which I didn't quite understand. I didn't know quite what was happening, but it was exciting to me to see what was happening and to see the form kind of, and materials, they kind of had a lot of the control. And I realized these weren't quite what I expected, and maybe they wouldn't be right for exhibition. But I made a decision, which is one I've repeated very often since, and that's to follow in my heart what felt right. In the late 80s, I started working with basketry materials and techniques, and it was for a variety of reasons. It's a beautiful material, but the basketry techniques allow more shaping than was possible on loom. It's freestanding on its own. It's wetted and it's made pliable while it's being woven. Another quality that I like about willow and other basketry materials is it forces abstraction. And around this time I was really wanting to come away from representational forms, and therefore, because you can't force basketry materials into detail, it allowed this broader, more universal kind of human form. Another finding about these basketry materials is because they're totally combustible, they lend themselves to the casting process, which came a little later, but already in my head, I knew it was a material that would burn out, and if and when it was possible for me to cast my woven work, I knew that these materials would be the materials of choice. I liked the technique, and I used it, and I've continued to use it in a number of scales for human forms. And I still use it because now it also forms the basis for work that is burnt out, lost piece, you might say, and it will eventually be interpreted in bronze. This is just bronze head, and it's the largest piece that I ever personally cast myself, which was at Haystack Mountain School of Craft in Maine when I took foundry there in 1989. It was then, of course, that I discovered the fragmentation, the holes that come out of the natural marriage of casting technique with woven work. It spoke to me about what I think of as the beauty of human frailty. And that's a theme that continues as I work with the bronze from woven work. This is Broken Head, and it surely is broken. It's one of those pieces I did at Haystack early on, and again, it was so broken away, I thought quite surely this one had to be rejected. But it sat in the corner a bit, and in fact, for some people, it's a favorite because there is so much missing, so much that the person needs to add to make it complete for them. The original was twined in seagrass, which is the same material as Kindred Spirits originated with. And it's a lovely material to work with. It's got a glossy surface. And I find that it's very interesting to see how much is picked up in the casting process so that the fiber itself is evident. This piece is called Courage, and it was named after the piece was finished. But originally I was thinking just simply in terms of a kindred spirit kind of form, an abstracted walking figure. And the material I was using was it's called inflorescence, and which is a vine I was given from a weaver down at Haystack who was at a basketry course. And this vine grows on palm trees in Florida. And so I used twine paper as a weft, and the material lent itself to a fairly formal, stiff figure. So when I was having it cast at the foundry, I was trying to talk them into allowing for the fragmentation to occur. And in this particular case, finally the president had really got it. He understood and allowed that the imperfect cast was fine for my work. But his men who were working on it were really reluctant to let it go. They wanted to mend the hole, which turned out to come in the heart area. And so being there in the heart area, it just kind of said courage. The original bronze color was quite interesting in this piece. It looked exactly like the original materials, and I may yet leave some that same color. It's got an interesting openness this time. This piece is called Vigil, and it's a complete failure from a technical point of view. And if one were looking at it as a cast piece, they'd say, well, that certainly is not valid. But because fragmented human forms tend to be something I greatly value, it speaks about the vulnerability of human beings. So the burnt out parts for me are every bit as important as the parts that are there. This is called Requiem, and I did it. Actually, I was working with the Foundry toward allowing for fragmentation of the work, and they were reluctant to allow fragmentation to happen. So they encouraged me that if I wanted a fragmented piece, I should start with a fragmented piece. So when I wove this one, my brother actually was dying at the time. I wasn't aware of what I was doing when I was pulling away parts of the original sculpture, which was woven in paper, basketry technique. And so I was pulling away, and I left it at the Foundry for casting. And when it was shipped down a few weeks later, my brother had died. And when I opened the package, it was rather shocking to me to see what I had done with pulling away the parts, because he died of throat cancer. And there was the throat kind of gone. So it kind of got to be Requiem. And it was one of those things that probably intuitively I was doing and not realizing. And it was after the fact that the piece spoke to me about who he was. This piece is a later one of the bronzes that I've done, and I really wanted to play around with openness. I liked the ambiguity of a title, Blue Madonna. It was interesting to use a minimal of a woven structure. Some of the earlier bronzes came about being quite open because of the fragmentation that occurred during the casting process. So this one started out being very open. And I'd like to do more of that open work. Willow was the original material. And it was woven like basketry technique, off loom. Since there are no rules, that makes it kind of easy, because you do what you have to do to make it shape.
Kindred Spirits in bronze stand outside Alderney Gate in Dartmouth, which is just at the top of the stairway if you were to come over from Halifax on the ferry. It's between City Hall and the library. They were created, the originals were made of fisherman's ropes fashioned on a loom I devised in my living room, and the finished pieces then were sent to Georgetown, Ontario, to Art Cast Foundry, where a very skilled staff helped recreate the original work in bronze. Each of the pieces has to be done in 2 parts with a massive sprue system. And they were extremely helpful in doing work which was risk-taking, and including the patination, the coloration. These were installed in 1990. It was a privileged kind of commission because it was one that allowed me to do what I really wanted to do. We all have dreams, and I had a dream to create woven sculpture that would endure outdoors. For years I had that dream. And now that dream's been achieved, and I can get on to other dreams.